A distinction I often make between healthy guilt and toxic guilt is healthy guilt moves us toward, right? I want to move toward this person to make that repair, but toxic guilt moves us away, go inward and into ourselves, into that self-loathing, self-punishing place. And actually the person who has been injured doesn't really get the repair that was needed.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Today, I'm joined by Hannah Alderete, a dynamic, emotion-focused therapist and certified relational trauma coach. She has spent the last decade helping adult children of narcissistic parents develop greater internal safety, emotional freedom, and a more compassionate relationship with themselves. Hannah is the author of an article titled Untangling Toxic Guilt from Narcissistic Family Conditioning, which is actually how I first came across her work. But beyond that, it was her writing on guilt, narcissistic family systems, and the lasting impact, and I quote, of emotional conditioning that helped shape the conversation I'm going to share with you today. In the first part of my conversation with Hannah, we're taking a deeper look at the difference between healthy versus toxic guilt. Have you ever wondered why saying no, expressing an opinion, or simply prioritizing your own needs can sometimes feel, and I quote, bad or wrong, even when you haven't actually done something wrong? And I put emphasis on that word because we need to get into the world of what we call unconscious fantasy. In this episode, we explore that question while examining how toxic guilt often develops within a narcissistic family system. I'm really excited to share this conversation with you. So let's get right into my discussion with Hannah. Hello, Hannah. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today to talk about a topic that I think many people struggle with, particularly those who grew up in a narcissistic family dynamic.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned in the introduction, I first came across your work in an article that you published about, and I quote, toxic guilt. And what immediately stood out to me was the distinction that you make between healthy guilt and toxic guilt. But before we get into any of that, let me just welcome you again and say, let's just start with a foundation in terms of how you think about the two different types of guilt. Maybe that's just a good place for us to start so we're all on the same page.
I love that. Yeah, fantastic. So, guilt, when it's in a healthy state, we could consider it a moral emotion that helps us appropriately address and repair that we may have caused harm to ourselves or someone else. It's the pain we feel, when we cause ourselves or someone else pain. And when it's really in its healthy state, it does mobilize us to take action. And I think maybe one of the most important emotions we have for helping us stay truthful to who we are and what we stand for. And, without guilt, we'd all be hurting each other all the time, breaking laws, abandoning our own moral codes. It would be a nightmare. So toxic guilt, however, is what happens when guilt stops being adaptive and becomes poisonous, which is really another way of saying it's like internalized self-judgment or condemnation that doesn't mobilize us to change.
It still breaks some sort of moral code. So with the healthy guilt, there's a moral code that we have just in terms of what we feel, I guess, is right or wrong or good or bad, right?
Yeah.
And then with toxic guilt, what you're saying is you still break your own moral code, right? This is an internalized sense of whatever your values are.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Right. Right. And the thing that happens is instead of recognizing, ooh, that didn't feel good for me, I want to make that repair, we go into this place of, I can't believe I did that. I'm so worthless. I'm so stupid. I shouldn't have done that. And it actually robs us of the chance to make appropriate amends. We go more into ourselves in that way.
I could see that. Yeah. Because if you're so busy beating up yourself, now you're no longer interpersonally connected, right? It sort of breaks the interpersonal bond.
Yes, yes, that's a beautiful way of saying that. It doesn't solve anything interpersonally because it's just creating this like self-punishment looping in our heads. And intrapsychically, it's really a defense mechanism, right? As children, this might have been a way to preserve an attachment bond with a parent or a caregiver. And the survival strategy in toxic guilt is to ward off anxiety for having complex feelings towards a parent or a caregiver as well, right? There's a kind of like splitting function where it cuts off our awareness of those complex feelings we may be having and turns us into either all good or all bad in that way.
How does that actually, let's play that out a little bit, because I think what you're saying now is really important to understand. So just again, for the listeners, to set the foundation is, we're talking about the overall sort of backdrop to this is someone who grows up in a narcissistically disturbed family system. Maybe I could say it that way.
Yeah.
Okay. And something happens, now you're getting into this, something happens in development, right? Because you're saying this is a defense mechanism.
Yeah.
But something goes on developmentally earlier in life that sets this foundation between whether later in life someone experiences the healthy versus the toxic guilt.
Yeah.
Repair with pulling into oneself. So maybe you could flush that out a little bit more and say something to that piece, like what's going on developmentally that these defenses are getting activated?
That's such a great question. And I think the way I think of it is particularly in narcissistic family systems, narcissists inherently create insecure attachment with their children. They don't support their kids in building the internal resources to meet their own complex feelings with compassion and acceptance. So if a child's not allowed to feel both anger and sadness and love and all of those feelings toward their caregiver, and if their caregiver, like a narcissist, responds to their feelings with judgment or ridicule or minimization, then that child will learn to sequester those parts of their psyche, we could say into the shadow, or just suppress them or push them down, where they don't have to feel them because they weren't supposed to hold all of those feelings together. So it's forms again like that splitting function of, oh, I'm not supposed to feel anger towards mom. That's bad, right? Let me push that away. And then of course, when it comes up later in life or in childhood, it can trigger that, ooh, I'm a bad person for having that feeling. Right. And
because that's the feeling, right? So it gets split off, but it never really disappears, right?
No, it doesn't.
And now instead, because these children learn from a very early age that it's not acceptable to express a hurtful or painful or aggressive feeling.
Yeah.
So it gets split off, but it comes back later in life. And that's the self-attack now that you're describing. Is that right? Like something is wrong with me. I'm doing something bad. Exactly. I'm not worthy, et cetera, et cetera. I see.
Right. And there was never a place for a child to bring those feelings to the parent because, a narcissistic parent is going to look at their child's feelings as threatening, probably to their own ego, their own sense of self. And so they respond with a lot of ridicule and, minimization and denial. So the child does not get the opportunity to learn how to have many feelings at once.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think what you're saying is if the family doesn't know how to contain a wide variety of feelings, right? Yes, the implicit message is something needs to happen, and that's where they get split off. Okay, yeah, I'm with you so far. Okay, great. Okay, because that was what I was wondering is where does something like this come from? And you're really sort of making this clear. It starts very early in life, sometimes explicit messages too, like, what's wrong with you? Don't cry or stop acting like such a baby, right? Or your sister doesn't take it this, you're too sensitive. Those things can all be very condemning statements. I would imagine that.
Yeah, that's right.
Get internalized to some extent.
Yes, really well said. That internalized self-condemnation. Yeah, what's wrong with me? Yeah, my sister doesn't cry. Why am I crying? Maybe they're right. I must be too sensitive. And it just goes on and on. Yeah.
Okay. So I mentioned in the intro that I first met you through an article that you wrote, right? That we spoke about that a moment ago about toxic guilt. So one thing that you mentioned there that I just wanted to flush out again just a little bit more is the child learns that you use this word, and I think it's so important, subjectivity disrupts the family harmony, right? Maybe you could talk, what is subjectivity from your perspective and how does it disrupt things?
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as like my sense of self, my feelings, my needs, my opinions and points of view, my individuality, right? And if that is not tolerated in a narcissistic family, well, and I should say, and it's not tolerated in a narcissistic family, then you start to equate your sense of who you are with being wrong or like a burden or an intrusion. And I do believe that is one of the great tragedies of narcissistic families, is that it imprints on children that their own subjective experience is wrong. And of course, then they internalize that, and then they become adults who end up people pleasing, or they don't have strong boundaries, or they end up self-sacrificing quite a bit because they haven't learned to honor and embrace who they really are.
You know, what's striking to me, and again, maybe we can flush this out a bit too, is someone can grow up, become an adult, and actually do something, literally, right? In reality, objective reality, that's harmful to another person, right? And have strong feelings about that they did something to harm somebody and they feel guilty. But what happens in what you're describing with one's own subjectivity is that it's a subjective experience. So even if I just assert myself and I say no to a request, right? Or I take an independent act, I do something, I go off to college when my parent is encouraging me to stay home and live with the family, right? Nevertheless, I could feel the same level of intensity, right? The same level of guilt as somebody who actually does harm somebody. I was wondering if you see it that way as well, and if you had any thoughts about that, because that raises a question, I guess, in my mind, is how do you tell the difference then, right? Because one of them is a healthy guilt. You know, like I really did harm somebody. You know, I said something hurtful, which we all do. I mean, that's just part of the vicissitudes of a relationship. Sometimes we do things inadvertently and we hurt somebody, or we do them intentionally sometimes. But then the important piece is the repair. But anyway, how do you then distinguish between healthy guilt and toxic guilt, which is more the latter, which is just expressing your own subjectivity?
Oh man, that is so layered, because I think on the first thought that comes to my mind is not all pain caused requires guilt. Like, for instance, having to tell a 16-year-old, no, you can't go out with your friends past midnight. They're going to feel pain, but that doesn't mean you necessarily need to, apologize and make a repair. It's like holding the tension, like, yeah, that is a boundary and I know that hurts, and yet this is for your own protection. I think that's an example of like not all pain requires guilt. So just to go back to like the distinction between healthy and toxic guilt, I mean, healthy guilt will feel kind of like relief in the end, meaning you'll recognize the wrongdoing and then you'll feel that internal desire to make amends. And at the end, there'll be just this contentment, like, I apologized, I made the repair, I can see that that felt good for them, that feels really good for me, I feel kind of back to baseline, and I can settle. And of course, healthy guilt does have pain. That's what motivates us, it's the pain. But it'll feel like, again, your own moral code sort of turning back on again.
Let me hover over this just for a moment so the listeners can be very clear, because this often gets confused, which means if we take like a hypothetical situation, I love examples, but it really sort of grounds things. So just because we're talking about a parent sort of child dynamic or adult child at this point, but we could say with any loved one, let's say you do something, and I mentioned this a moment ago, and you hurt them. So what you're saying right now, right, Hannah, is if you make the repair and it's genuine, right? Like you say, I recognize that I hurt them and I need to think about why I did that and what motivated me to hurt them. You make a genuine effort to repair the damage that you created, regardless, right, of whether they accept the apology or not. Healthy guilt will allow you then to feel sanguine, right, about yourself and what you did, and some level of forgiveness, because now you've attempted to repair the damage you created, even though they may not accept it. You could feel good about you. Not that you feel good, but at least that you've done the most that you can do to repair the damage that you caused.
That's exactly right. I think that's a great point you made, whether they accept it or not. It's how did you show up for that person in that moment? Were you connected to your own value system? Yeah, and I think if you can answer, I showed up the exact way I'd want to, I'm connected to my values, I feel resolute in this, then you'll know that that was healthy guilt mobilizing you. And a distinction I often make between healthy guilt and toxic guilt is healthy guilt moves us toward, right? I want to move toward this person to make that repair. But toxic guilt moves us away. We go inward and into ourselves, into that self-loathing, self-punishing place. And actually, the person who has been injured doesn't really get the repair that was needed.
Yeah. Let's make this a little more complicated because all that is clear.
Yeah.
But toxic guilt continues with some people, right?
Yeah.
And you said something earlier, and maybe I'm connecting two things. I'm forcing it, but you'll let me know.
Okay.
Earlier, you mentioned that this develops as a defense mechanism from very early in life. And I thought you said something about the attachment. Did you speak to the attachment at that? Did you say something about toxic guilt and attachment?
Yes, there's an aspect of, it's an attempt to preserve the attachment bond. It's a survival strategy.
Okay, so stay with that. So someone has more of the toxic guilt, the turning in, right? They cannot stop ruminating. There's self-punishment. And I've seen cases where they even inflict physical harm to themselves. Like they pinch, they punch, they may burn, etc. Right?
Yeah.
How does that maintain the bond? Like, how are you making that link right there? Because you said they turn inward instead of being interpersonally connected now. They're not repairing, but they're in their head. Yeah, please.
Yes. No, that's great. So if you weren't pinching, burning, hitting, the question would be, who would you actually be pinching, burning, hitting? And usually it's the parent, it's the other person, right? I'm so mad at this person, but I'm not allowed to be angry. I'm not supposed to have feelings toward them. So it turns back on the self as a way to preserve that bond, right? Because especially with children, this is obviously different with adults, but children will often equate the feeling with the act, right? Like I feel like hitting my mom, or I feel so mad at her, or whatever the thing is. And that can create like oh my gosh, I must be bad response inside. So, well, I don't want to hit mom because if I do that, then I may lose her and I can't survive without her. And obviously this is not happening consciously. This is unconscious.
Yes.
So I will attack myself instead. I will be the sacrificial lamb, so to speak, to make sure that this relationship stays intact, because I don't believe if I express my feelings, my mother or my father will be able to tolerate them.
I got you. Okay, that makes sense. That makes me think of one other possibility, and I'm curious. I want to bounce this off of you, okay? So when the child growing up in this family dynamic, we said, also they figured out a way defensively to preserve the bond, but there's anger there, right? So there's a lot of anger. There's an aggression that gets split off. They can't assert it. They can't express it because of the fear they'll lose the other, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So in part, when we're talking about guilt at this moment right now, I imagine we're also talking about anger and aggression. Is that fair for me to say?
Yeah, I would believe that to be true. Yeah.
Yeah, because then I want to highlight this because in a moment or two, we're going to talk about healing or what happens when you start to loosen or you try to help somebody begin to loosen the grip that the guilt has on them and what you could expect to see. And oftentimes what emerges is a very aggressive side of the self, again, that had been sequestered, right?
Yes.
So you're feeling angry at this parent. Let's think, okay, because I had another thought. I wanted to follow this through. So the guilt, the defense, and the toxic guilt protects them from expressing it. So that's one way to think about it. And I was thinking there's another way to maintain the bond, okay? Which is now it becomes a role reversal. In other words, they are intertwined, they're connected, they're entangled still in a relationship with their parent, but they now are the aggressor, you see, because one can say what the parent did to them very early in life, although it never presents this way, because that's the difference between the borderline and the narcissistic structure. Oftentimes, people who are more organized at the borderline level come from far more aggressive families, families that are overtly aggressive, physically abusive, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in these narcissistic families, what you see is more what? Think like me, behave like me, make me feel better, right?
Yep.
But in any matter, it's still aggressive, nevertheless, because it wipes out your sense of who you are, your identity. That's what we're really talking about here.
That's right.
So I'm just trying to finish this thought. You are then maintaining the bond by the role reversal is you are now the aggressor. You see that? Like you are identified with the parent. You are like the parent in this way, treating yourself in a very cruel and harsh way.
That's beautifully said. Yeah.
Okay, good. Sorry it took me so long to get that out. I couldn't really It was too much. Like I was trying to think it through, but
It's so layered. It's so layered. I mean, you're talking about that introject, right? Now I've taken in the parent and the way that they have treated me by minimizing my feelings or telling me I'm wrong. I am now doing that to myself.
Yes.
That, right? And that becomes the toxic guilt. I mean, you could also even say the toxic guilt is the internalized parent.
I like this because you introduced the word introject, and this brings back fond memories from maybe a year or two ago. I did a series of episodes and we spoke about this. Like this is a malignant, toxic introject, right?
Yes.
Which is different than most people, in everyday language, people talk about a superego, right? That's your moral compass, what's right, what's wrong. But the superego isn't necessarily always punishing. Sometimes if you fail to live up to its expectations, but not like what you just said, not like an introject, because an introject is quite malignant. You see, it gets internalized in a way that all the aggression is not integrated with the more loving part. Like the superego has both because it's looking out for you as well. Anyway, I'm sorry. I got a little too technical, but you mentioned introject and you got me excited.
Gotta love an introject, right? Yeah.
I love a good introject conversation, right? All right. So what have we done so far? Let's just pause because we kind of went down a rabbit hole, but at the very least, what have we done? We've spoken about guilt versus toxic guilt. And then naturally we went back then to early development because we wanted to understand how does toxic guilt even develop?
Yeah.
And in part, we wanted to do this because, and I think this may be a good place for the conversation to go, but you can let me know. Is we want to always think about healing or like loosening up this grip that this introject, this internalized parental, whatever you want to call it, an introject, an imago, an identification, but there's something that gets internalized, like you said. And the ultimate goal, I would imagine, is not to tell somebody like to feel less guilty, but to begin to loosen the grip that this thing has on them that's deep in the unconscious.
Yes. Yes.
There's still so much more to say about this, but we have to stop here for now. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now.